begin tonight's event, I am overjoyed to announce Dr. Erin Baxter, who is our curator of anthropology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Welcome, Erin.
Hey, thanks, Tessa. Thanks for having me, and thanks all everybody for being here. I'm super excited to welcome you. And just to reiterate what Tessa's already said, I was talking today in the Stonehenge exhibit with a couple of guests and talking about what an age it is to be alive in this particular age of Stonehenge. And we know that Stonehenge has been through many ages, from its inception and construction and the many uses across peoples from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age and beyond, the rediscovery of it, the mythologizing of it. That's why we have Merlin hats in the gift shop, on up in all of its iterations through the modern era, where it's gone through places where it's been interpreted as a calendar and a computer, how it's been appropriated by druids and pagans and other groups who have been drawn to it for a variety of reasons. For a period of time, it was known as Stonehenge, and a place where aliens arrived. So all of these sorts of things have really led us to this most modern era, where the new sciences and new humanities are coming together and collaborating in places like this tonight, where lots of disciplines approach the problem of understanding Stonehenge from all different perspectives and learn from each other. So with that in mind, we have two incredible, stellar, if I might say, scholars for this evening, both from the University of Colorado Boulder. And I would like to introduce first one, who will speak for about 20 minutes, and then the other. And I hope that you will stay for the whole program, because it is going to be wonderful. And first up tonight is Dr. Erica Ellingson, who is a fellow and associate professor at the Center of Astrophysics and Astronomy at CU Boulder. Her research is amazing. Her CV makes me purple with jealousy and awe. She has trained at MIT and at Arizona. She's widely published. She even uses data from the Hubble telescope. So she's trained in all the things that scare me, but I find so incredibly fascinating. And she teaches on galaxies and cosmologies, and most recently on ancient astronomies of the world. And that is what led her to us and us to her, as she is lending her experts tonight to the astronomers' real interpretation of Stonehenge and its solstice. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Erica Ellingson. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be working with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and to be able to tell you all a little bit about the astronomy of Stonehenge. I'd like to share screen. So tonight I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the astronomy of Stonehenge. This is really just one of the aspects of Stonehenge that you can explore, we can try to understand. But it is one that has probably shaped it from its very beginnings and is still celebrated today. Now, I'm hoping that many of you, if you haven't already been to the exhibit, are planning to go very soon. And I don't have enough time to give you the full big picture of Stonehenge, but let me just give you a few outlines so you know some of the things that I'm talking about, some of the features. This is, of course, the most famous of megalithic sites, and it is located in Salisbury Plain in southern England. It's been known as an amazing place throughout history, and I'm sure prehistory as well. And the first written account, this is from a Roman traveler, talked about a large island somewhere in the northwest, but a magnificent sacred precinct of Apollo. This is the sun, and a notable temple which is adorned with many votive offerings, and is spherical, or perhaps round in shape. And so this actually may be one of the first things that they notice, that there's an amazing place and it's dedicated to the sun. Now, the structure from outside to inside, again, this is just to give you a little orientation to what it looks like in the different parts of it. There is, on the outside, a 300-foot ditching bank, and this is the thing that you call a henge. It's basically a big circle that defines, you could say, the outer reaches of the circle, perhaps of the sky. There are 56, they're called 56 Aubrey holes. These are chalk holes in which early on in Stonehenge's history, it was used as a cremation cemetery. I won't talk too much about these, but looking into the inner center of Stonehenge, there are, of course, the famous and amazing stones. There are two types of stones I'll be mentioning. There's a circle of smaller, what we call blue stones, in sort of making a ring of small stones. In the very center of are 5 sets of trilithons. These are the really, I can't believe it, they are so big stones. And of course, the capstone ring that was built a little bit later than both of those features. And so think about, for the stones, these 3 layers, the trilithons in the center, the blue stones, and then the capstone ring on the outside. And these make up the general, very basic shape. Here's the difference really to see between the blue stones and the trilithons. The blue stones are usually are single stones. If you go to the museum, you'll learn fascinating stories about how these stones were quarried 150 miles away, and their significance over a much wider region and much longer history than just in Stonehenge. You can see from the little picture on the right the size of the sandstone trilithons. These are, again, the most amazing stones that you'll see on site. And this is a picture of Stonehenge as it is standing today. You can see that the outer circle is only partially erect, but you can still see examples of these other stones, including the sort of horseshoe shape, the U shape of the biggest stones. Now, I want to really bring your attention to something outside of the circle, though, and this is what's called the avenue. This is another henge. It's a ditch and bank that stretches, nearly 3 kilometers from the circle. Not all of it straight, it bends a little bit. I'll talk about that later. But it defines an axis that cuts all the way through the inner circle. And in fact, the trilithons are positioned to look northeast along it. So the entire circle now is aligned along this avenue. So this structure is sort of interesting. There is definitely a meaning to it. And one of the questions is, why was it built like this? Why does it have these particular features? Why build Stonehenge at all? I'd like to look at this from the point of view of what I'll call a skyscape. And this is really a reflection of what you may say a landscape. The skyscape is half of our environment, and one that in this day and age where we tend to look down instead of look up, we tend to forget. But the skyscapes were half of the environment of ancient people. Everyone who lived under the sky knew the sky, and the brilliant and beautiful things in the sky were truly inspirations. Now, the solar year, following the solar year, the seasons, going across winter to summer and back again. This is, of course, utmost importance, particularly if you've got a garden, if you're dependent on growing things for your food. And many cultures all over the world followed the seasons, followed the motion of the sun throughout the seasons, and marked it in ways including buildings, structures to be seen along the horizon, really amazing shapes and features of sun and shadow. And so this is something that is really common across the entire world, that people watch the sun and they built things to celebrate the seasons. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what do we mean by the solar year, the seasons, what is the cycle that these people were thinking about? What I have here is what I would call the scientist's point of view. I'll talk about the ancient astronomer's point of view in a moment. We have the sun in the center of the solar system. This is not to scale, and the Earth going in an axis around it. Now the Earth's axis, our north-south axis, is tilted 23.5 degrees away from the axis of the orbit that we go around. And I'd like you to take a look at the top picture there showing the sun and the Earth. Do you see that the Earth's axis is tilted away? The north is tilted away from the sun, and the sun is shining on the southern half of the Earth. This would be, us northerners are pointed away from the sun. The sun is south in our sky. In fact, Australia is having their summer right then. We go across, and then on the other side of the year, 6 months later, now the north is pointed towards the sun. The sun is high in the northern sky and shining much more directly at us. That's our summer. And so each year, because of the Earth's axis tilt, we get a winter to a summer and then a winter again. And that's really what we call the reasons for the seasons. And the thing that we would see in the sky is that sun going north in our summer and south in our winter. And I'm going to have what we call the northern bias and talk about the northern hemisphere. So from this slide, have a look. Now we're talking about the ancient astronomers or the modern astronomers' view of things, with their feet firmly on the ground, looking at the sky around you. This observer is facing south. And off to their left to the east is the sunrise. The sun travels across the day to sunset on their right-hand side. Now, over the course of the solar cycle, you can see the sun would move to the north for the summer and move to the south for the winter. So we get a pattern of sunrise and sunset. I'm used to doing this in person in a big classroom. I'm trying to get it on the little screen, going from winter in the south to summer in the north. You can see a short day, a little arc, and a long day, the big arc. But what is probably more interesting to the Stonehenge builders was where the sun rose on that horizon. And over the course of the year, the sun goes that south to north and south to north. And so if you look at where the sun is going to rise, it'll tell you, well, what season it is, and then with some accuracy, what time of year it is, and particularly the solstice. Solstice means sun stands still. And as the sun rolls along the horizon, it goes fast, low, 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 stop, solstice. And then rolls back like a pendulum, slow, stop, solstice. And so this is what you would see if you're standing, say, in the middle of Salisbury Plain, looking at the horizon and watching the sun to see what the sun will do across the year. So looking at the structure of Stonehenge, what we see is that the avenue and the main axis of the monument aligns with the sunrise on the summer solstice. This is unmistakable, an indication that the people who built Stonehenge cared about the cycle of the sun, the solstice, where the sun would change its direction and come back in the other direction. And so this is the type of astronomy that everyone pretty much agrees that Stonehenge was built to celebrate. Now, one of the ways you can think of looking at the solstice is against one of the stones that's still there called the heel stone. This is a large stone that's located well outside the bank, and it marks a place along the avenue. But this is not probably the only stone that was put up in that place. And in fact, we don't think it is the only stone that was used to mark the direction of the summer solstice sunrise. What we think is that perhaps there's another stone there. There's evidence there was a stone that might have been moved over and might have been lost. It's not quite clear, but likely where the sun rose was in between the existing heel stone and another stone that's not there anymore. There are also other stones that were erected along the avenue area as well that might have also helped to frame what the sunrise looked like. This is a simulated view of one aspect of what Stonehenge might have looked at one point of its history. And you can see standing in the center, you can see out to the blue stones, the sarsen capped circle, and then another set of stones in the avenue, and then the heel stone and that missing stone 97 in the background. And so if you could imagine the sun shining down that avenue and what that would look like with these tiers of windows going across the avenue, going along that one direction towards the solstice. And this is what it looks like. Now, the sun appears to be rising over the heel stone, but that's only because it actually rose on the horizon a little bit to the left of that. It was behind the trees. Just as it banked over the trees, it also just happened to be positioned right over the heel stone as it stands in its slightly crooked position today. But this is what you feel like, this is what you see today when you go on the summer solstice. This is another thing that some people think is possibly very interesting. This is the shadow of the stone. And on very early in the morning, the shadow is very long, casts a long finger. This is a little bit after solstice, it's a little bit offset, but at the exact time of that alignment, that shadow penetrates right into the center of the monument as well. Something you see, would they have seen, would they have cared? But another thing you can think about with solstice alignments is that there is an axis that points both at the midsummer sunrise in the northeast, but it's the same axis that goes all the way down to the midwinter sunset in the southwest. So really, it could go either way. We tend to think about standing in the center and seeing the light come into the center. But it's actually possible that Stonehenge was built for you to come down the avenue to make a procession down towards the monument at sunset in the winter. And that's perhaps what you would see. Now, there's actually some evidence saying that the winter solstice might be the solstice that was actually celebrated. There are other Neolithic monuments around Britain and elsewhere that seem to be aligned only in one direction, celebrating winter solstice. There's also evidence from bones of animals that were used, we hope, that were probably associated with feasting during one of the celebrations in the Stonehenge area. They're bones of animals that were consistent with being born in the spring and then eaten in the winter. And so this actually is what many people think was the true spectacle of Stonehenge, was the winter solstice sunset and not the sunrise at all. There's also some speculation that Stonehenge had something to do with the moon, and I want to put this with a pretty big maybe on this as well. Out on the bank, there are 4 stones that are called the station stones, and they make kind of a rough rectangle around the inner circle. There are 4 stones, and 2 of them have barrows, so they have burial mounds. It came probably after when Stonehenge, when it was all set up in shape. 2 on either side align right along the main axis for the solstices, and so those look pretty, pretty much the same story. But the other 2, if you line them up on the other axis, what you see is that they're actually tilted just a little bit. The alignment is just a little bit, well, if you look towards the south, it's just a little bit too south. Can you see the difference between the solstice alignment in yellow and those lines connecting the station stones? It's off. It's just a little off. And in fact, it's off in a way that is just beyond the midwinter sunrise. Okay, and that's a place, that's a direction where, I'm sorry, but the sun don't shine in that direction. So what could be in that place? It turns out the moon has the possibility of tracking the sun's movement in a slightly different pattern, but the moon's orbit is tilted another 5 degrees off the sun's path in the sky. That 5 degrees means that the moon has a little bit more leeway and actually can go a little bit further outside of this hardwired solstice boundary back and forth. The sun goes back and forth. The moon has the possibility to squinch just a little bit further than the solstices. So this might be interesting. This is a schematic showing the southern solstice position. So now we're looking at just a few degrees right around where the sun would be rising in its southernmost position. And the moon has a range, just a little bit, a few degrees on either side. The moon can go across that range. Now, is that interesting? Does that ever happen? And the answer, this is a longer story and a few more diagrams. So I'm just going to tell you the answer here. Because the moon's path twists in a circle around the sun's path in the sky, the configuration between the moon and the sun, and when the sun is south and when the moon can be north, this configuration, this rotation around of the 2 orbits means that the moon can only get past the solstice in a cycle that goes every 18 or 19 years. And so this is the thing that people might have noticed after watching the sun. You know, the sun from year to year is doing this. And then the moon transgresses the sun. The moon goes further than the sun, becomes, well, different from the sun, beyond the sun. That might be something that people were noticing. So that's something we can only speculate now. Did the Stonehenge builders actually notice this other 18, 19-year cycle of the moon? If they were real sky watchers, the answer is very likely yes. But then did they care? Did it have any meaning to them? And then the third thing is that the reason for the station stones and the positions they are. These are 3 big questions. And so the moon association with Stonehenge is really, really not completely firm. It's something we can speculate on, but without other information about perhaps other Neolithic sites that might be associated with the moon. There are some of these, but are not built in the same way. We're still speculating on this rather than saying that there was astronomy here. We know that, at least in terms of their worship of the sun. People always ask, and these days they seem very fascinated with the idea of how accurate is Stonehenge. And the answer is not terribly accurate, but very likely accurate enough for what they needed. Now, remember that this was a visual spectacle that they were probably making, and the stones and the alignments and the avenue, it's good enough, so it's within a few solar diameters. You can see the sun and it's in the right place. But at the solstice, the sun stands still. The sun moves slowly. And so in terms of, does it get the date? Does it get the hour? It gets within a handful of days, probably enough to make up for the really bad weather that you have in England. So I'd really like you all not to think of Stonehenge as an observatory. It was built to look at the sky. You could see the sky everywhere. Was it a calendar? Well, maybe not a calendar to say this is the day, but maybe instead a calendar that says this is the time to do something to celebrate the sun. Some people have called it a calculator, which really projects our fascination with accuracy and numbers and this sort of way of looking at things onto Neolithic people. Please don't think of it as a calculator. It is a location, and a location that was very important to people, but still was not important in the way that we tend to think astronomy or ways of looking at the sky, the way of looking at time is important as well. So there are also Neolithic circles all over Europe. These 4 pictures are just in Cumbria, one area in northern England. There are 1,300 circles just in Britain. Very, very few have anything are astronomically oriented. And yet these circles are there. They have significance. People built them with quite a, not as big as Stonehenge, but they built them with effort. And so they are probably celebrating something that's culturally similar to Stonehenge. But again, the astronomy is not here. And so that was maybe not the number one point of building a stone circle. Now, Greater Stonehenge might give you a little bit more idea of the significance of Stonehenge in a larger landscape. There's a lot of wonderful material about this in the exhibit, and I really hope you'll go and spend some time learning about Greater Stonehenge. There are dozens of other Neolithic sites in the area, and we'll keep on finding more with LIDAR and other types of technology, ones that are built big enough to circle entire villages as well. This is very close to Stonehenge here. You can see what we call barrows, burial mounds, other little henges. They're popping up like mushrooms after a rain all over this entire landscape. And this is a map. Everything that you see marked here is a Neolithic site. I want to bring your attention to the avenue. You can see it's going up to the northeast from Stonehenge, but then it curls around and goes down to the river, the Avon River there. And it's the idea of a procession that this avenue evokes, this idea that you're coming up from the river onto the plain, and then there is this monument out in the middle of an open field. That may be something that we can project our idea of what would be amazing, and maybe something that they shared with us as well. In the upper right-hand corner, there's another site called Durrington Walls. Let me show a picture of that here. It's another one of the very large kind of circular sites that we found in the Stonehenge area. It also has a circle made out of wood timbers called Woodhenge that does have a solstitial alignment as well. It's not there. What you see in this picture is a reconstruction. But unlike Stonehenge, where people were buried, all we see are ritual and burial remains. Durrington Walls is where people lived, where they had their feasts, their parties, maybe where the builder camp was, maybe where they gathered. There is an avenue from Durrington Walls down to the river valley, and the avenue to Stonehenge. And so there's an idea that we have a dichotomy between land of the living, place of the dead. This may actually mean that the entire landscape of Stonehenge was reflecting a way of looking at the world, including the skyscape of Stonehenge also. So we do know that Stonehenge was an important place for people to celebrate the movements of the sky. It's not unique throughout the world. These are just examples from all over the world, many countries of Neolithic and Bronze Age places where people looked at the sky and encoded their understanding and their celebration of the things that were happening in the sky. And so Stonehenge perhaps is one of the most amazing, most prominent ones, but this is something that people have done all over the world and through all of the ages as well. Now, I wanted to end with just a couple of minutes about my own visit to Stonehenge. I had not been there at all personally until 2019. Found myself through great luck to be in the UK at the summer solstice. And so my daughter, who was traveling with me, we got the last 2 tickets on the bus to go to Stonehenge. We arrived at 1 a.m, walked through a dark field, seeing something glowing in the distance, seeing the stones rise ahead of us, and maybe 1,000 people there, drumming, playing horns, didgeridoos, all of us there sitting and waiting. I'm not good with crowds. My daughter said, but don't you want to stand there in the stones? This is the 1 day a year they let people inside the stones in a big group. Don't you want to be right there, Mom? Don't you want to be looking down the avenue? I said, yeah. And so she took me by the hand. She wove me through the crowds. She placed me in the 1 square foot with the best view of the sunrise. And I was there sort of gibbering away, and she put her iPhone on my head and took this picture. So there we were with 1,000 other people having our own Stonehenge experience. Mine was connecting with the astronomy that people have been doing there for 5,000 years. Other people came with their own reasons, with their own reactions of what Stonehenge is. And as you can see, we made lots of friends, including this druid fellow named Simon. It was an extraordinary experience. But keeping in mind that summer solstice was maybe not the solstice that was celebrated at that place in Neolithic time. When we got together again for the winter solstice, my daughter and I decided that we would celebrate our experience with Stonehenge in a different way. And we created Fudgehenge. And so this was my experience and my ongoing connection, both with the sky and with Neolithic people, and of course with my daughter as well. And so Stonehenge continues to give us all meaning in many different ways. And I'd like to then turn this over to Deborah to continue to help us understand what Stonehenge means to us across the epochs, across the centuries to the present day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erica, Dr. Ellingson. That was wonderful. I think we maybe need to revise the quote from Benjamin Franklin, and we should change it to not to death and taxes, but to death and sky watching. It seems to be a universal phenomenon. Thank you for that. There are questions in the chat for you, and we'll get to those at the end. But I would like to, it's my really great honor to introduce Dr. Deborah Whitehead, also from the University of Colorado Boulder, who is coming with us in a capacity that I think is extraordinary. She is Associate Professor of Religious Studies of all things. And when I was trying to come up with programming for Stonehenge throughout its run at DMNS, I was trying to think of creatively about interesting things and interesting people to say. And I can't tell you how many people suggested this professor of religious studies for that very cause, because her study is on modern religions, politics, media, and culture. She specializes in William James, having studied at Florida State and Harvard Divinity School. But she also brings to bear an expertise on religious studies and how we reinvent and reinterpret and come to understand religions that are not our own and express them at places like Stonehenge. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Whitehead to us, and I know she's going to give an extraordinary talk. So thank you for being here, Dr. Whitehead.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, and it's great to be with all of you. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share screen as well, although I am just going to warn everyone that I'm not going to top Fudgehenge. Nothing can top Fudgehenge, so we'll just start with that disclaimer. Thank you. So I'm going to talk, as has been alluded to already, about the many religious lives of Stonehenge. So this is a monument, as we've already heard, that has this rich and amazing history, and the exhibit at DMNS does a wonderful job of pointing all of that out. And I want to talk about sort of one piece of this history, which is the religious history of Stonehenge. And so most of us, if we've heard anything about the religious significance or history of Stonehenge, we've probably heard about its association with druids, right? And so this idea that Stonehenge was associated with druids, or with druidry, with the religion of druidry, is an idea that goes back to the 1600s. So the first person to propose that Stonehenge was one of many Druidic temples across the English landscape, was first proposed by pioneer English archaeologist John Aubrey, the same Aubrey who gave his name to the Aubrey holes that Professor Ellingson talked about in her presentation, in his Monumenta Britannica, kind of an encyclopedia of the British landscape. And this gave rise to a vigorous 17th and 18th century debate about the religious significance of Stonehenge. And it also contributed to the what we call the Neo-Druidic revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries. And here you can see is one of the earliest photos of Stonehenge from 1877. So a really important source in that Neo-Druidic revival in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was actually Julius Caesar and his commentary on the Gallic Wars, which is written from 58 to 49 BCE. And Caesar said in that document that Druids were high-ranking members of Celtic society. He said that their primary social roles were to conduct, and it's a quote from him here, divine worship, the due performance of sacrifices, private or public, and the interpretation of ritual questions. He also said that one of their main beliefs was that the souls do not perish, but after death pass from one to another. And he said that they were concerned with the stars and their movements, the size of the cosmos and the earth, the world of nature, and the power and might of the immortal gods. So you can see here some of the threads that we're going to pick up later on in the presentation. This idea of divine worship, ritual expertise, an emphasis on death and the transition from life to death, and a focus on nature. Now, these ideas, these kind of earlier ideas that Aubrey proposed, that there might be a connection between Stonehenge and ancient Druids, were popularized by an English antiquarian, physician, and Anglican clergyman named William Stukeley. And his goal in doing this was to combat varieties of Enlightenment secularism, free thought, and deism that were then circulating. So his goal was to convince readers that ancient Druidic religion was completely compatible with and actually a form of Christianity, specifically the Anglican Christianity that he himself was a teacher of and a promulgator of. And so from his work and from his writings, we have amazing illustrations like this, which is a 1722 engraving called "Druids Sacrificing to the Sun" in their temple called Stonehenge, completely based. This is not drawn by Dr. Stukeley, but it's based on his ideas. And you can kind of see here the rays of the sun at the top, the arrangement, the kind of imagined arrangement of the stones, and the kind of ritual worship that's taking place here in this circle. And Stukeley also did some of his own drawings, and these are some of the earliest drawings that we have of Stonehenge and also of other Neolithic monuments, henges, and sites around England. So Stukeley's drawings are valuable in that they show us a picture of the site, a glimpse of the site as it existed in the 18th century. And this is a copy of his book. And in the book, which is the full title is Stonehenge, a Temple Restored to the British Druids, and this was published in 1740. In this book, Stukeley is accepting the kind of literal biblical version of history, right? So he's accepting that the Genesis account of history is accurate, and therefore he has a much more recent date for the construction of Stonehenge than we now know is accurate, right? And remember his agenda that I talked about before, which is to sort of entice people to read the book because they want to find out about these mysterious ancestors called Druids, but actually to argue in the book that these Druids are not pagans. They're not representing a religion that's different than Christianity. He argues that they use Stonehenge as a temple, that they're ancient monotheists, that they're proto-Christian, and that they follow follow a religion that's actually descended from the biblical patriarchs. And he calls this patriarchal Christianity. So he says that the ancient Druids who worshipped at Stonehenge were actually Christian, and that again, their form of Christianity is completely compatible with his version of contemporary Anglican Christianity. And he also says that the Druids built the stone circles and surrounding sites to represent the Christian Trinity. So this neo-Druidic revival it gives rise to what we call modern neo-Druidism or modern Druidism. So I kind of want to make a distinction here between the form of ancient religion that Caesar and other Roman writers comment on and give it, and we have archival evidence of tantalizingly short, though, like less than 10 pages total of writing that we have about ancient Druids. And then the revival of this, what is called neo-Druidism in the 18th and 19th centuries as a consequence of the writings of people like Aubrey and Stukely and Romanticism and this kind of fascination in this post-Enlightenment era with recovering a form of religion that's indigenous to Britain, that's prehistoric, and that's pre-Christian. So kind of getting back to the authentic, true, if you will, British religion that's rooted in the land that predates the Roman conquest and the Christian conquest of Britain. And so this is about glorifying Iron Age Celtic peoples. It draws on the fascination with ritual sites like Stonehenge and Avebury, and it's kind of an imagined attempt to kind of think about their original purposes, the original purposes of these sites. And it also connects with British nationalism in that it postulates Druids as the core of British resistance to Roman conquest, with some evidence in the writings of Caesar, although Caesar's commentary and the accuracy of his statements about the Druids has also been called into question, which is a kind of longer conversation. This is a 19th century painting that's kind of from that period and this kind of imagined revival. And then kind of fast forwarding to modern Druidry, or what we might call neo-Druidry again, some of the core concepts are respect and veneration of ancestors and of nature, often involving participation in environmental movements. So there's a really strong environmental focus and commitment and activism among a lot of contemporary neo-Druids and neo-pagans. Again, this is rooted in their closeness to the land, to nature, to using nature as ritual sites, whether those are stone monuments like Stonehenge or groves of trees. There's also an association between Druids and trees, which goes back to another story from the Roman historian Tacitus. He tells a story about a battalion of Roman soldiers burning a Druidic grove to overcome Druidic resistance to Roman conquest. So there's that association as well. So strong commitment to environmental activism, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. But the thing is, even though we can trace some of these similarities, right, between ancient Druids and modern Druids, like veneration of nature, ritual worship taking place outdoors, connection to trees, and some of these sites like Stonehenge, a set of beliefs that vary, but that involve veneration of ancestors and of nature. Despite all those similarities, there's no real historical continuity from a scholarly perspective between modern and ancient Druids, right? Because much of early modern Druidry, the revival of Druidism that I was just talking about in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, is based on outdated or incorrect theories about who Druids were, where, when they lived, and what some of their practices were. So there's a kind of continued debate within modern Druid and neo-pagan communities about how accurate reconstructed Druidry and reconstructed neo-paganism is, with the reactions to that sort of running a spectrum from some people saying there's absolutely a complete continuity, there's no separation or no there's no discontinuity between we are literally continuing the practices of our Neolithic ancestors, and others saying, no, well, it is kind of an invented tradition, but we are attempting to pay homage to the past, and others kind of taking a middle position in between those. And today, many groups, including modern day druids and pagans, gather for ritual ceremonies at Stonehenge on the summer solstice, which again is interesting, right? Because as Professor Ellingson pointed out, we actually have a lot of evidence and a lot of good arguments for the idea that it was the winter solstice that was the more significant ritual activity at Stonehenge, and perhaps the purpose for which it was built. But in modern times, it's the summer solstice that really attracts the most celebrants and the most worshipers. And these varying religious groups, these contemporary religious groups that come to Stonehenge, whether they're identified as druids or as neopagans or as spiritual seekers or just the curious, view Stonehenge as their temple. They view it as literally a temple, as a sacred site. So coming to Stonehenge for these ceremonies is the equivalent for them, we might say in Christian terms, of visiting a church or a cathedral. And because of that, worshipers have at times clashed with local and national authorities over their right of access to the site, and have petitioned for special access, especially around the solstice, but also at other times of the year. And the 2020 and 2021 Stonehenge Solstice celebrations are to be held virtually. So last year's was obviously virtual, and they've announced, English Heritage has announced recently that 2021 will also be virtual. So Dr. Ellingson and others who got to see 2019 that was really lucky, I guess. And finally, I want to introduce you to someone named Stonehenge King Arthur. His name is Arthur Uther Pendragon, and he's a really interesting individual. He's a former British Army officer. He's an environmental activist. He's a neo-Druid leader, head of one of the orders of Druidry in England, and a media personality. And also, and not last but not least, he sees himself as a reincarnation of King Arthur. And he is one of, I think there was a mention of Merlin earlier, and he's one of those who have argued for a connection between King Arthur, Merlin, and Stonehenge, with one theory, of course, not accurate, but a myth about Stonehenge, dating back a couple hundred years, that rooted in British folklore, that it was actually Merlin who built Stonehenge magically through conveying the stones through magic, because it was impossible that they could have been carried there by ordinary human means. Stonehenge King Arthur is famous in the British media for successfully protesting against English heritage, actually on numerous occasions, but most famously, he protested for several years in the 1990s for English heritage to allow unrestricted access to Stonehenge on the summer solstice on the grounds of religious freedom. So he argued under the UN Charter of Human Rights that his right to religious freedom and to freedom of conscience was being hampered by being prohibited to have access to the site. And in the year 2000, English Heritage allowed that access, as we've already heard. So that has become a regular part of the solstice celebration since then. He's also been involved in a number of other protest actions, including protesting having to pay parking fees to park at Stonehenge. He's done some sit-ins there, I think once for 10 months at a time. And he's currently, and this is kind of big news, heading opposition efforts to a planned construction project by the British government that would actually divert the road right now that goes by Stonehenge. And there's always, lines of gawkers in their cars sort of staring out. So this new project would tunnel under Stonehenge, would actually remove that or distance that roadway access and place a tunnel under Stonehenge to better address the traffic problems. And Arthur and many other druid and neopagan leaders in Great Britain have vehemently opposed this on the grounds that it would involve the desecration of that site. So if you all are familiar with some of the protests that have made news in the United States in the last few years, that involve claims of land access and the sacredness of certain sites like Mauna Kea or Standing Rock, right? It's a similar argument that these planned construction projects or planned observatory construction projects on Mauna Kea and the pipeline, of course, at Standing Rock would involve the desecration of sacred land. And so there's a similar argument being made here. And I think currently those plans are on hold as a result of these protests. So Stonehenge is this site of many different theories, many different histories about its uses, about its imagined uses, many myths about what it was used for and what it might be used for today. And it continues to be this very vivid, active, living, and also contested site. And thank you very much. This is a picture of me at Stonehenge in 1985 with my best friend. And you can kind of see the, actually, this is the year after the Stonehenge Free Festival, which was a music festival that ran from 74 to 84 at Stonehenge, back when access was allowed. That was ended in 1984 and was sort of seen broadly by the British public as a kind of hippie, sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of festival. And so here we are the year after that, not knowing any of this history, but with a rope giving a wide berth to keep out the hippies and also the visiting middle schoolers. So thank you so much, everyone.
Oh, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I loved every minute of that. Thank you so much. Both Dr. Ellingson and Dr. Whitehead, welcome everyone to our Q&A portion of the evening. So go ahead, and if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. There are already some to start off. I also just want to acknowledge that it was wonderful to have both of you share pictures of yourselves at Stonehenge, because a lot of our participants are also sharing personal experiences of Solstice Celebration and going to Stonehenge. So I thought that it was a really wonderful connection. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat for you, Dr. Ellingson. Kitty was wondering, you mentioned something about the tilt of the axis of the Earth. And so does that mean that the furthest south sunrise and the furthest north sunrise would have been 23.5 degrees?
I'm happy to answer that question. Actually, could you turn my video on? I think I've been...
So I don't have permission to turn your video on. So you should be able to do that, but I will ask you to start your video and then you should be able to click on the button. Brilliant.
Excellent. That's a really nice visual question for you. It is 23.5 degrees along the sky, but that little arc on the sky, when you lay it down on the horizon, gets longer. And so it's probably, I forget the exact number, I think it's 55 degrees, something like that, a little bit more than 45, as seen from the latitude of Stonehenge. And another way to think about this, if you think about how that angle might change, think about summer solstice and where the sun would rise as you go further and further north. It gets stretched out further and further until when you hit the Arctic Circle, it hits 90 degrees. That means the sun actually never sets. And so that angle from solstice to solstice widens up as you go further north and also further south as well, until in the Arctic Circle, they come to meet at the end and you have no sunrise and sunset. So beautiful, really visual question.
That relates to Ted and Judy, who celebrated the solstice in Sweden at one point, were remarking on The length of time. For you, Dr. Whitehead, someone was wondering, and I'm not entirely sure if you have the content for this, but the St. Jean celebrations of the Francophone world, are they related to solstice celebrations? Can you speak on that at all?
Sure, yeah. The short answer is no. The Saint Jean celebrations are celebrating the nativity of Saint John the Baptist. So it's the Christian liturgical calendar, and his feast day is June 24th. It's close to the solstice, but it's not, what's the right way to say this? It's not formally affiliated with the solstice. Yeah. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some association in terms of contemporary celebrations, or even in terms of when the feast day was designated, because we know that the Christian calendar was mapped on to pagan calendars in many ways, right? To Greco-Roman calendars in many ways. So, you know, the birth of Jesus on December 25th is also close to the winter solstice, right? And so there's different theories about that mapping the Christian calendar onto Greco-Roman sort of known feast days or holidays might have been one way to assimilate Christianity into the Roman Empire and to sort of ease the process of conversion. And that's something we see around the world as Christianity spread into different cultures. But as far as we know, no official connection, although it's close.
And then I'll open this up to both Dr. Ellingson, Dr. Whitehead, and our own Dr. Baxter. Do any of you know, were some of the stones fixed or moved since the 1700s? Has there been any updating happening?
I'm happy to take that one. Yes, a number of stones have fallen through the years and been recycled, and actually they've been lost to history. But we know of two occasions where stones actually collapsed, in 1797 and then again in the mid 1800s, and people and local farmers heard them sort of fall down. And when the British military sort of took over the site in the very, very early parts of the 1900s, they actually reset a number of the stones and there's film, and you can look on YouTube to see that. And it actually has sort of sparked a number of conspiracy theories that Stonehenge was never authentic, that it had always been faked by the British government and the like. But yes, they have been reset on several occasions.
That's fascinating. And then I know, Dr. Ellingson, you talked about a wide range of circular formations and stone formations. Susan in our chat is wondering about Newgrange. They say that Newgrange didn't originally have the stone that allows the sunbeam into the interior. Do you know about the original intent and purpose of Newgrange? Though again, I'll open this up to all three of you. Dr. Ellingson, if you know, or Dr. Whitehead, if you have insight, or of course, Dr. Baxter, if you have anything to say on that subject.
You know, if I could share screen just for a minute.
Sure.
And show you one of the slides I flashed at the very end. And so if you can see this in the very center of the slide here, this big round thing, that's Newgrange. It's a large Neolithic structure that's located in Ireland in the Boyne Valley, another area that's extremely rich in Neolithic structures and Neolithic sites. This one has a single door, and it's a chambered tomb, which has a long corridor leading into a place with a couple of niches, sort of an interior space. This is aligned with the winter solstice. And this is another reason why we believe that winter solstice might have been the ticket for Neolithic people rather than the summer solstice. The question was, it may not have had originally the stone that allowed the sun to come in such a tight beam down all the way into this narrow corridor to illuminate the thing in the back. I don't know about that particular structure, but I do know that Newgrange, Maes Howe in Scotland, a bunch of other tombs in Ireland, all did really have features that allowed the sun to come in on these particular important dates. And so if Newgrange was, Newgrange is very likely built along that notion. I'm not sure about the particular stones that allow it to have the visual impact that it has today.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And Erin, you are answering this in the chat, but if you would like to answer it more widely, Linda was wondering why the military took over the site.
yeah, I don't know the political implications of it, but I know it's a strategic area on the Salisbury Plain in sort of southern England, and they were there for a number of decades. And there are lots of extraordinary photographs of biplanes flying over and tanks and men sitting in and among the rocks. The military was famous for putting a pretty significant road through the middle of the site, and they also did they propped up, and so they damaged and then tried to repair a number of stones, and they actually ended up vacating in the early 1940s when Professor Piggott, and those of you who saw the dig about Sutton Hoo and the excavation there, you know, Peggy Piggott, who later divorced him, was married to that man, and he was responsible for the excavations at Stonehenge and a lot of mess ups in the 1940s and 50s. He was actually quite famous for having said in the 1950s that they hadn't found anything in a decade of digging. They hadn't found anything of significance that was museum quality. And so they just reburied or threw into the river everything that they had excavated over the course of those that time. So the movie kind of got him right. But anyway, but yes, the military did do some damage. And then it's now since been rehabilitated by English Heritage, which has taken over the site.
That's fascinating. And it sounds like English Heritage has kind of a storied history with Stonehenge King Arthur. I'd love to hear some more about that 10-month sit-in.
Yeah, he did a 10-month occupation at Stonehenge, finally was removed. And so he's been, I forget what he was protesting that time, but I think maybe it was something, he wasn't paying the parking fees or it was something that he was protesting. I'm sorry that he's such a colorful figure that I don't remember all the details. I should say too, one of the other contemporary issues he's involved in, along with protesting the new tunnel, is he's petitioning English Heritage for the return of remains. So I think there's 40 different remains that were excavated from the site and taken elsewhere for study. And he's petitioning to have those returned as an act of desecration, a grave desecration. So petitioning to have those returned and reburied at the site. And again, this kind of parallels some of the legal issues in the United States around Native American indigenous groups petitioning for the return of ancestral remains to their original sites, petitioning museums and universities and things like that for the return of those remains. So yeah.
That brings up, if you don't mind me following up with that question, I'm going to ask Dr. Whitehead an unfair question, is that I teach the archaeology of death. I'm super interested in this, and I'm the NAGPRA officer for the Denver Museum. And so we have this relatively clear, linear, genetic, oral history linkages between descendant community members and the remains of indigenous people that archaeologists have dug up in the past, and that allows for an easy right of return. Based upon your lecture, that seems to be not as direct a line of evidence for Mr. Pendragon. Is that what he goes by, King? I don't know, yeah, Mr. Pendragon. How does he make that argument? He's such a fascinating character because he's an allied archaeologist in a lot of ways, and he is not a detractor, but he's he goes against sort of archaeological interests in sometimes as well. But I wonder what you thought about that relationship between the druids and the ancient remains.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There aren't the ancestral linkages that there are in these successful NAGPRA cases in the United States. So far, he hasn't been successful in his attempt to have these remains returned. But yeah, that doesn't deter him from trying. Yeah. By the way,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, this whole story, this was new to me when I was doing research for this presentation, that Stonehenge was actually purchased for 6,600 pounds at an auction, in the early 1900s.
Sorry. It was actually sold before that to George Washington's great-grandfather. So Americans kind of have a thing for Stonehenge, just say. Sorry.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like, a guy went to purchase dining chairs and he ends up buying Stonehenge for 6,000 pounds. And then later on gives it to the government. So yeah, just a really fascinating history. I'm sorry.
No, that is a fascinating history. I also, all the crosstalk is the best. That's like my favorite part of anything. That's why it's cross-disciplinary. And speaking of that, Dr. Ellingson, something that really resonated with me during your talk that feels like it has this tie into culture is your discussion of date versus time, and how perhaps Stonehenge was more suitable for a culture who lived in a region where weather was not always perfect for like when the sun crossed at an exact moment. That was just something that really stuck out to me as being interesting culturally.
Mhm. I think this is something that we tend to project onto other people, our own particular experience and use of time. In one of my classes, what I often ask my students is, how well do you need to know what time it is? And increasingly, my students say to the minute, which also happens to be the accuracy of the device they probably have in their hand. And I'm really struck with that focus on to the minute. I need to know this with the technology at hand. Certainly for people who didn't have accurate ticking clocks the way we do, or electronic clocks, that sort of time was not as important. And if you are doing something like watching the sun, finding the right time to celebrate the sun, that idea of accuracy of time might have been days or maybe a week, and that was sufficient to the needs. And so our concept of time is always in that context of what do we need to actually to know about time.
I was also, oh, please continue.
Oh, okay, this is a little bit off the time topic, but Deborah, you reminded me of one of my stories about going to see the Stonehenge solstice. The music festivals indeed were a great big hippie gathering. They have tightened things up, but they still do allow people to come in on the solstice days. They have a cordon around it, and as you go through the cordon, they do a bag search and everything. I, in my purse, usually carry a little vial that has like some Claritin and some ibuprofen in them. They went through my purse. I pulled out the vial, says, oh. And I said, oh, it's just over the counter stuff. They said, oh. And so they made me go, and I checked it, a little bag check. They put my, put a little number on it and put it on the shelf, and it was there afterwards. My poor daughter was, I can't believe my mom got caught carrying drugs into Stonehenge.
That's fantastic. Dr. Ellingson, you were also saying something about evidence pointing perhaps to the worship of the moon. And I was wondering, Dr. Whitehead, if you knew anything about that, if there was anything in those very scarce 10 pages, or even something that, I don't know, Tacitus said about the worship of the moon in that culture.
Only there's, again, as you said, tantalizingly little in those quotes. So like, the quote from Caesar about, the stars and the sun and the moon. So just tantalizingly little to, it doesn't, those ancient sources don't overemphasize the sun to the degree that more recent sources do. Does that make sense? They kind of just have it's a broader kind of conception of veneration of nature in these past sources, which includes the moon and the stars and the sun and all those other things. So the emphasis on the sun seems to be maybe a little bit more recent, a more kind of recent imagining, which again, I think these, Dr. Ellingson, the paper that argued that it's the winter solstice that actually was the focus of celebrations, I think came out just last year or something. It's fairly recent, right?
I'd heard about the pig bones at some point in the past. Yeah. Again, I think that the evidence has been building, and particularly the material archaeological evidence about the sorts of activities and when those activities could have happened. And so I think they are really narrowing it down, along with some of these other sites, which are definitely winter celebration sites. I think our picture is firming up that it was a winter, and that this avenue that you would proceed down is of great importance as we discover more and more about how huge that landscape is and how all those different places in the landscape connect with Stonehenge as a central point.
Yeah. We have a question in the chat, and please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. This is a wonderful discussion. They're wondering, how does Stonehenge relate to the Nebra sky disk from Germany?
I don't have a picture of the Nebra sky disk in my PowerPoint, but I can try to describe it. It's a beautiful thing. It looks like a shield, but it has a bunch of gold inlay on it, which is evocative of things that might be going on in the sky. It is also Bronze Age, I think. So don't quote me on this. I believe it's certainly a little bit after the beginning of Stonehenge. but it is an artifact that is quite evocative. It has a moon on it. It has a cluster of stars that people think are perhaps the Pleiades, which are very commonly shown in many, many places around the world as being very important stars to be watching. It also has these sort of arcs inlaid on the edges, which might be that arc of the sun swinging on the horizon. Again, that one, accuracy, does it matter if it was accurate or is it simply evocative of that visual effect? But it probably also has an indication that people cared about the sky enough to make beautiful things that reflect the sky in some way. So it's it's another one of those amazingly beautiful things that is still very evocative.
And on that, is there any indication that anyone might have celebrated the full moon in the same way that they celebrated these solstices?
Who still celebrates the full moon? I think that's everyone does, everyone has. In terms of setting that celebration into stone, that's the thing that is more difficult because the movements of the moon really they're very hard to untangle from the movements of the sun unless you have much more information about crescent moon versus full moon, except for this really nebulous cycle, this 18.6 year cycle that's really very subtle. And it's been suggested that many places around the earth, around the world, people have tried to encode that little extra swing back and forth over this 19-year time scale. Some of them may very well be true. Stonehenge, I think, is very tentative. I will tell you, all you Coloradans, that probably the best place that has evidence for looking at that lunar cycle is in Colorado. It's Chimney Rock National Monument, which is down in the southwest of the state in between Pagosa Springs and Durango. It is one of my favorite places in the world. It's extraordinary. And it is between the rocks, the astronomy, but also really solid archaeology. I think it may be one of the most convincing sites for that sort of moon worship, that sort of moon significance.
And while we have our head in the stars, panel attendee with the last name Romero is wondering if any other planets or stars align with the stones.
Not at Stonehenge. There are other indications in other places that stars were watched very carefully. The Pleiades were very significant, and there are places in Malta where there were large enclosures that were built to point at the Pleiades, possibly tally counts, watching other stars rise in sequence after the Pleiades. So there's a tremendous amount of information about how these things, how people interpreted and then embodied the sky in the things that they built. And so the answer is Stonehenge. We don't have evidence for planets or stars. Other places, absolutely, we do.
And then for all three of you, including, I'm sure, Dr. Baxter, what is the current thinking on how the stones were erected? Were there crane-like structures or any kind of tools used?
Oh, this is my favorite topic. I'm sorry to jump in, but there's this great subdiscipline of archaeology called experimental archaeology, where people actually try to reconstruct the technologies and the methods of the past. And there are equal parts disaster and hilarity and success and insight into how ancient people did it. And what I think has been demonstrated through the past is that through arm strength, the average Neolithic woman had the arm width of an Olympic rower. So that's how strong many of them were on average. So they were doing lots of labor all the time, but just through basic arm strength, teamwork, levers. And actually a plumber from England did a wonderful demonstration about this, about moving those great sarsen stones with about 40 people and about 8 or 9 levers, 4 or 5 on a side of a sarsen stone. And then they built it up and then they rode it. They literally rode the sarsen. And these 40 rookies in the early 90s had no trouble moving it 100 yards in a day. So the sarsens came from Westwoods, about 20 to 30 miles away. The bluestones we know came from much further, but there was a great documentary just released by the BBC that you can find on YouTube that showed 50 school kids having no trouble just dragging on a sledge a bluestone across a field. So it's totally doable. And this experimental archaeology is showing us how they got those things erected and constructed.
Wow, that's so cool. And Dr. Baxter, how do we know that arm strength of an ancient people?
Well, we look at diameters and diaphyses of long bones, and we measure that as a reflection of muscle mass and repetitive stress injury. So when archaeologists talk about the contentious nature of human remains are a time capsule into the past, and this is why we have to negotiate carefully with descendant community members who might find that problematic, with our own consciences as we grapple with that sort of phenomena, and as really insightful sorts of data points for knowing about ancient people.
This is so fascinating. Let's continue this conversation for 4 more minutes. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Dr. Ellingson, as a studier of ancient astronomers, you talked earlier about your northern hemisphere bias. What do you know about ancient astronomy in the southern hemisphere, and does it have any correlation to the way we study astronomy, or did study astronomy, in the northern hemisphere?
In terms of correlation or contact, I would mainly, look at pre-colonial sites in South America. Also, in Australia, there is a wealth of cultural context and rock art stories. It's extraordinary, very, very deeply enmeshed in Australian culture. But let me get back to South America. The Inca, Machu Picchu, and other places near Cuzco, other places in the area, they definitely were very concerned with the sun god Inti. In terms of, did they work that into stones, into their buildings, edifices? Very likely, yes. There have been some studies that I think are overinterpreted, but there are definitely intimations that from Machu Picchu, there are particular directions associated with the winter solstice and with the sun penetrating into inner parts of sanctuaries, which would be associated with the sun as well. And so we do see these in different places in the Inca world and also the pre-Inca world as well. I can't emphasize enough that when we do find out about prehistoric or pre-colonial or traditional people, by talking to the descendants, talking to the people still practicing, we find that everyone has a connection with the sky, and this is universal, and this is eternal in many ways. And so something like Stonehenge, I think, still speaks to us as in a religious and a mystical and a spiritual way, but also in a way that connects directly to that I see the sun and it's rising, and this is a celebration.
That's wonderful. Dr. Whitehead, and I think you touched on this during your presentation, but who did the druids worship?
Yeah, so the druids are, the term refers to a priestly class of Celtic religiosity. So Druidry and Celtic religion are not different from each other, at least in the ancient world, right? It's sort of a way of referring to a priestly caste within Celtic religion who are responsible for the conducting of rituals, for communication with the gods. And someone asked earlier, gods plural, yes, absolutely. Theirs was a polytheistic religion as far as we know, involving worship of many male and female deities and communication with them and performing certain rituals, almost a shamanic kind of quality of connecting humans and the divine and performing rituals in that way. So the argument, Stukely's argument that ancient druids were monotheists and actually biblical monotheists was a very bad argument. That was kind of the point of that slide. It was a bad argument. It was an ideological argument designed to sort of further his own interest as a member of the Anglican clergy who was concerned that people around him in the 17th and 18th century were abandoning Anglican Christianity. So they worship many gods is the short answer, and representations of different natural elements. Some people have talked about modern Druidry is almost animistic in nature, which means the idea that spirits sort of indwell in natural phenomena like rivers, trees, waterways, things like that, stones even potentially. So yeah, there's no sort of no one set of beliefs for modern Druidry or modern neopaganism. These are very eclectic contemporary traditions that involve a variety of different positions on the existence of God. You can be an atheist neopagan, you can be a monotheistic neopagan, you could be a polytheistic one, you can be spiritual but not religious. So they're sort of famously non-creedal today, and emphasizing just ritual performance and the connection with nature, and a commitment to environmental activism, to being in nature, to preserving nature and human beings' connection with the natural world. So it's kind of a contemporary religion that's lived out more as a practice rather than a set of beliefs, which is how we sometimes in the Western world tend to think narrowly about religion.
So interesting. And finally, last question for all of you is, if you could correct one myth or misconception about Stonehenge, what would you correct?
Oh, it's got to be the aliens. I think it's got to be the aliens. We haven't talked about that yet. Yeah, the aliens.
Beyond the ancient aliens.
Yes. Yes. So on YouTube, you can find there's an episode of Ancient Aliens that was devoted to the idea that aliens created Stonehenge as a kind of a spaceport. So it's round and there was probably a roof on it. And this is how alien spacecraft landed and took off. And they built Stonehenge and many other structures like that around the world, like the ones Dr. Ellingson has shown as different landing stations around the world. So that would probably be the one that I would try to dispel. And it's just, I'll just observe just very quickly, it's very interesting, the contrast between the ancient alien theory of sites like Stonehenge and the archaeological research that Dr. Baxter talked about, which really, humans can do hard things, seemingly impossible things. They can move heavy stones, they can build enormous creations like pyramids and these kind of megaliths. So it's just kind of interesting the ways that we think about the past and what humans are capable and not capable of doing, and bring aliens in to explain what we think might have been impossible for them.
I would also say on exactly the opposite tack, the idea with aliens is that people couldn't possibly be smart or capable enough to make this. On the other swing, though, end of the swing, though, is they were these amazing calculators, and they could calculate the exact position of the sun using geometry and calculus, and they had all of this knowledge before even the Greeks had this knowledge, when in reality they were able to access this information simply by being very conscientious observers of things that anyone could see. And so, yeah, you don't have to have it built by ancient aliens, but it also doesn't have to be something that an IBM computer has to be able to calculate to make it happen.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I thought that this was really wonderful, and hopefully we can all bring a little bit of consciousness to our own observations in these approaching days. Again, there is an exhibit on Stonehenge currently at the museum, so if you would like to come see it, I'm relinking that in the chat so that you can get some tickets. It will be at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science through September 6th. And with that, have a great evening, everyone, and we hope to see you at the museum very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.